Okay, thank you, Simon, for the introduction. I've put the title up there, The Science of Decision Making, the Head, Heart and Gut. I'm no scientist in decision making. So what I'm actually going to talk about is probably what I call bush science, stuff I've picked up over the last 3 decades in consulting, but also in farming as we do, and like you guys would have up in the Hunter, challenges when we get extremes in climatic events as well as prices and things like that. So this is what I've learnt over that 3-decade period. Both from a farming point of view, but also from an interest I've had in consulting, particularly around the mixed farming side of things and the decisions we make about what is the optimum enterprise mix for an individual farm business. I want to start off with a quote that was given to me by a woman when I was doing a road trip with the GRDC in Western Australia. And she said, and I was talking about decision making, and she said, just because we make decisions all the time doesn't mean we're good at making them. And it sort of stopped me in my tracks a bit, because I thought, she's probably right. You know, we make hundreds of decisions a day. Some are pretty simple, some are more complex. Some, if we get them wrong, don't really matter much to the business in the long run. Other ones can be extremely, influential in what happens to the business going forward. And got me thinking, and Tony came up with, mentioned this as well, the idea, when were you taught to make a good decision? I can remember going to school and being taught how to read, how to write, how to do arithmetic. And a lot of that stuff, as Tony rightly said, you practice it and you do it over and over again, because it then becomes second nature. You don't think, how do I need to write? How do I add up 5 plus 5? You just do it because you've practiced it so often. It becomes habit, it becomes a process. And really got me thinking about when we're actually taught to make a good decision, and what, if you like, is the science behind making a good decision. Sort of been looking into this over probably the last 15 years, and I want to share with you some of the insights that I've had from exploring that topic, and also want to finish with showing you a tool that I've found very useful, that I use with my farmer clients as well as our own farm, of how we can help enhance our decision making. So as Tony said, we're not trying to make these decisions in crisis. We've actually planned for them, and we have processes in place when we do hit those different critical decision points. So first of all, decision making is a skill, as I said. Tony's analogy of a sporting one is exactly right. The reason why you practice so often is that when you get in the heat of battle, it just becomes second nature to you, and you can pull off something that looks quite difficult, and you can do that when you're under a lot of pressure and under a lot of stress. So it can be taught and it can be practiced, exactly the same as that sports analogy. And you can become more confident in making your decisions, and what I'll call making better decisions or good decisions, which I'll talk about in a tick. So what have I learned about decision making? And I'll run through about 5 or 6 of what I reckon are probably the most influential things that I've come across. First one, I think it's important at the outset, is to separate this difference between a good decision and a right decision. We all want to make right decisions all the time. You know, every decision we want to make sure it comes out perfectly. The bottom line is, and you will know this in farming, that it doesn't always work out right. And the main reason why is because we have to make decisions on information we've got at a point in time, then we roll the dice, and then hopefully at the end of the day, it works out the way we liked or the way we predicted or thought it would come out. And so to me, the difference between a good decision and a right decision is that a good decision's informed. Do you have the information? Do you have the right processes in place to make the best decision you possibly could at that point in time? A right decision is when we can reflect on it in hindsight and saying, gee, that was the right thing to do. It was great to sell those animals at that time, or it was, wasn't that a good decision to buy that block of land, or the right decision to buy that block of land? But you can only work that out in hindsight. And so I'll talk through the rest of my presentation about this idea of good decisions and not right decisions. So good decisions are those planned, informed ones. Also importantly, when we're making these decisions, is we need to understand the risks around those decisions. Okay, as I said, because we're rolling the dice, we need to understand what are the odds, what are the chances of things happening. Just Graham Creed's quick presentation before I came on, he was talking about the likelihood of something being greater than something else, the likelihood that it will be average to wetter over the next few months. That's around risk. That's around you understanding that the odds are it's probably going to be more likely to be wet than it's going to be dry. Doesn't mean it can't be dry. It just means that the odds or the chances are probably greater for it to be wet than dry. So understanding risk is a very important part of this. That was the first thing I actually stumbled across when I was looking at the mixed farming stuff. And I asked people, why do you choose that enterprise mix of this much crop to this much livestock? And they said, it's a way we manage risk. And so risk is a critical thing that's underpinning a lot of our decision making. Next thing, and this was the heading on the slide as well, this idea about the head, heart and gut. And if this is the only thing you remember from my presentation, I'll be really happy, because I think if we can appreciate what this actually means, it helps a lot in our decision making. There are three things that influence our decisions. One is the head, one is the heart, and one is the gut. And I'll just step through each of these very briefly. So the head, as you probably guess, is around the facts. It's what I call the analytical type stuff. It's the sort of the calculations we do, the spreadsheets we do, the trial results that we look at, and we process that information, those facts, as part of what should be, quite rightly, part of our decision-making process. Okay, and we're very familiar with that. And a lot of our science is built on head type stuff, built on the facts, built on information that we can get. Okay, but there are two other things that influence our decision as well. One of them is the heart. And the heart, by this, I'm talking about our beliefs, our preferences, our values, our biases, all of those sort of things that just feel right. And the number of times that I've heard people say, no, let's just stick to the facts, and other people are saying, almost in a sense, ignoring the facts because there's something else that's driving their decision. And that's the heart side of it. I remember someone saying to me that a lot of farmers do man maths. And by man maths, what they were talking about is they try and justify from a head point of view what they actually want to do. So if they want to buy that new green header, they try and justify it by increases in efficiency, when in fact what they really want is the latest header with the latest gear in it, because they get pleasure and enjoyment out of that. So their decision isn't only just on the numbers, their decision is also on other factors as well. And the third part in this head, heart and gut I want to touch on is the gut side of it. Most people have probably heard of the expression gut feel. Gut feel is that intuitive type response you have when confronted with a situation and a decision you've got to make. Most people have probably made decisions where they think, I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't sit quite right with me. That's your gut talking to you in your decision making. And it's really important as a factor in understanding that's a factor in our decision making. We tend to build up our gut feel through experience. And so the longer you've been around the block, the more times you've experienced drought, the more times you've experienced fire, you learn from each of those experiences, and that becomes part of your decision-making process. And so the head, heart and gut are three influences. And it always annoys me when people just want to talk about the facts. When we're making many of the decisions we've got to do on farm, the head, the heart and the gut are all equally important. And so what I'd be putting to you is, don't be afraid to start thinking about and putting on the table, these are my heart values that are actually influencing the decision, and this is what my gut's telling me about this decision. It's risky. Okay, you mightn't have the facts around that, but from your past experience, you think that it's risky. And all of those at least need to be surfaced and considered as part of the decision making. Two other things that come into this head, heart and gut calculation. One is this idea of temperament or your personality. And I haven't got time to go into it in this talk, but your temperament has a big influence on how much the head, the heart and the gut play in your decision making. And it's worthwhile, if you want to really get into the science, of understanding a bit more about your own temperament, because you'll know which ones you naturally put more weighting or more credence or emphasis on in the head, heart and gut. And the other one is, just briefly, I want to talk about this idea of complexity. And complexity, there are different decisions we have to make in the spectrum of farming. Some are pretty simple. You want to drench some cattle, you work that out by estimating or working out their weight, and then you look on the drench drum and it says so many mil for so many kilos of live weight. It's a relatively simple decision. Towards the other end of the spectrum, you've got what I'll call these complex decisions. Complex decisions don't have a recipe, don't have a right answer, and there are lots of different ways to be able to achieve the outcome that you want. And the head, heart and gut, and particularly the heart and gut, have a greater influence as decisions become more complex. And a lot of the big decisions we need to make in farming are complex. So again, it reinforces this idea that the head, the heart, but particularly the heart and the gut, have got to be surfaced and have to become part of the decision making if we're going to make good decisions. A couple of other things that I've learned around decision making is that commonly there are many factors to weigh up. Rarely, if we've got to make a decision, is there only one thing we need to think about. There's often multiple things, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 things that we need to sort of weigh up or balance up. But importantly, they're not always of equal value or equal importance. Some things, given the situation, might be more important, you think, and should have more influence on the overall decision than something else. So remembering that there are multiple factors and that they are not necessarily of equal importance. And so it's this idea of what I talk about, making decisions on balance. So there'll be pros on one side of the equation, there'll be cons on the other side of the equation, and depending on the relative weighting or importance of those pros and cons, it'll potentially tip the scales one way or the other, which then informs your decision making and the decision you're going to make. And you also think differently about your decision as the conditions change. And I'll explain a little bit more about this. So this is where the risk side of it or the odds side of it come into it. I'll just give you a couple of examples to try and spell this out a little bit more. So if you've got a decision you're confronted with, would you think differently if the forecast that Graham gives you in his next presentation is for a very wet, let's say decile 8 or above season, or a very dry decile 2 or below season? I'm guessing that if you've got a decision around, let's say, if we're going to keep stock or not, should we buy or sell stock, this will be something, forecast would be something that might influence your decision, and the description around what that forecast is going to be like would change your decision. So if it was going to be very wet, I reckon you'd think differently about your decision than if the forecast was it's going to be very dry. It's probably not the only thing you're going to make your decision on, but it is one of those factors. So as it goes from decile 8 to decile 2, you think differently about your decision. Another example, you've got animals that are in saleable condition, but the price was at an all-time high or the price was at an all-time low. I'm guessing that would come into your decision-making about, do we sell or not sell animals that are in a saleable condition. So what I'm emphasising here is these descriptions, are they at an all-time high, are they at an all-time low, are really important as a contributing factor to you understanding and making a good decision. And I'll come back to this in a process I'll show you at the end of my presentation. So how do we bring some of those key facts together where we've got to include the head, heart and the gut influences? So how can we create a process where all three of those can come to the surface? How can we incorporate risk into it as well, or odds into it as well? I've put in brackets there, personal, because it is personal for each individual. So each individual have a different position on risk, and that will depend on a whole lot of things, your financial position, your stage in life, what your aspirations are, and so on. So there's no one right answer on the amount of risk that you need to take on. Risk is personal for each individual, and you need to set that. So how can we create a decision process that allows us to incorporate risk, but risk at your level that you want? The third thing we've got to bring into this is how do we weigh up those multiple factors that I was just speaking about that may not all be of equal importance? So how can we put, if you like, different weightings or different balances on those pros and cons that we spoke about? And the final one, which I haven't touched on yet, is this idea of having to balance timeliness against time to think. Quite often the best decisions you make need to be made in short periods of time. So we don't have the luxury of waiting for months and months and months. The opportunity that a decision requires, we've sometimes got to pull a trigger when you'd really love to know more about something. You'd like to have more predictability, but you can't have that. So we do have to make things on a timely basis. Balanced against that, though, is the need for what I call time to think. Now, we're talking about the science of decision making. This fella, Daniel Kahneman, I don't know if anybody's heard of him, but Daniel Kahneman's a professor at Princeton University in the US. He wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in a nutshell, his argument is that we think too quickly and make decisions too quickly. And we have to balance up our decision making to a point where we think a bit about our decision. He actually won a Nobel Prize for this work, this science around thinking, which you might think is pretty obvious or pretty simple, but in fact, it's got an awful lot in it. So if you really want to know about the science, this is not a holiday read, but it is a very good book about balancing up the time you spend thinking against that timeliness of when a decision needs to be made. All right, I want to finish off my presentation now by taking you through what I call the 7-step decision matrix. And this is a process that I've come to use and come to love. As Tony said, that practice, doing it time and time again, it now has become sort of second nature to me when I need to set myself up with a good decision-making process. I was first introduced to it by this fellow who's on the picture there. It's Barry Mudge. He's a farmer and consultant in South Australia, actually farms north of a place called Port Germain in South Australia. You don't have to go far north from his farm to go over what's called the Goyder Line. And people might be familiar with that. The Goyder Line is basically where desert is, which has been deemed in this country as where you can't farm because there isn't enough rainfall. Barry and his family have been there for multiple generations. They've expanded over that period and they're a highly profitable farm business on very marginal rainfall. And he's learnt how to make really good decisions when rainfall is so critical in his whole operation, and deciding how that's critical to him. If he gets that wrong, that can cost him a lot of money. So it's the first time I saw this process, and he uses it as one of the decision-making processes to decide each year how much to sow. So just because he's got thousands and thousands of hectares doesn't mean every year he sows thousands and thousands of hectares. So I want to give you an example. So I'll work through this on a step-by-step sort of basis. So the context or the story, if you like, that this decision applies to, so imagine you've been through a period of drought and you've destocked. More favourable season is now facing you and you need to make a decision about possibly buying more animals. So the first step in that context of saying, do I buy more animals, is actually defining the decision. Now, this might sound a bit dumb. You think, well, I know what the decision is, but I can tell you, unless we're very clear on what that decision is, we can get quite confused and quite, it makes it more complicated if we're not clear on what the decision is. So the decision in this context, in my mind, is simply, do I buy more stock? So that means that the decision is going to be pretty easy. At one end, it's probably going to be yes. At the other end, it's probably going to be no. And there may be something in between. But we're quite clear on what that decision is going to be. Another decision might be, yes, I am buying more stock. How many do I buy? That's a second decision that you would go through. But let's stick with this one. That first critical decision is, do I buy more stock? I've put in there that sometimes you might include a step about the timing of the decision. We have on our farm some of these decision processes that we pull out every year at a certain time. And sometimes it takes us 10 seconds to work through and we go, everything's cool, it's all running according to plan, we're looking good, put that decision process aside until next year when we've got to pull it out. So we've prepared for it or planned for it, as Tony mentioned. Second step is to list the major considerations that should influence a decision. So this second step is about that idea of what are all the critical things we should consider? What are the pros and cons that we should think about? Now, I've just made this one up. Well, when I say made it up, it actually came from a group in Queensland, a farmer group in Queensland that I worked with who were confronted with this decision that they came up with, all major considerations. First of all, do I buy more stock? They want to think about, or part of their decision should include the amount of feed they've currently got available, what supplementary feed they might have available, what the seasonal forecast is, the availability of suitable animals that they can buy. the likely margin to be made, and access to finance. Do they have to borrow that money, or do they have that money on hand? So they said in this group, these were the 6 critical things that they needed to think about, which I'll call that step 2, or those critical factors. Now, you might look at those and say, I wouldn't include seasonal forecast or supplementary feed, but I'd include something else. That's fine. Just remember, this isn't a recipe. This is a process I'm taking you through, steps to take you through to build some robustness around the decisions you're going to make. Okay, so they come up with these 6 major considerations. The next step is around, for each of those major considerations, to think at what point would I think differently about my response. So that comes back to that previous thing when I said if the odds or the descriptions are different, we might think differently. So they're what I call my tipping points that I think differently about it. So if we take the first major consideration, that we said the current amount of feed available is something we've got to consider, I would think differently around that consideration if I've got heaps of feed from either pastures or from early sown crops, if I've only got a fair or average amount of feed, or if my the feed I've got available is still very tight. So in influencing my decision, do I buy stock or not, current feed available is one thing I'll consider, and I would think either more positively or more negatively about that decision if I've got heaps of feed or I'm still very tight. If you run through that for all 6 of them, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, this is what the group came up with. So some of them, and most of them, are quite descriptive. So for the seasonal forecast, it was short-term favourable and positive in the long term. And at the other end of the scale is that it's bleak in the short term and it's bleak for the long-term forecast. So in the seasonal forecast part of the consideration in making my decision, I'll think differently depending on where they rate on that, if you like, scale or score. And we do that for all 6 of them. Again, if you'd rather, instead of current feed available being heaps, you might say, I'd rather that to be 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. That's fine. That's what you'd write in as those different conditions. Okay, so the third step is creating conditions for each of these major considerations that we've got. The fourth step is then assigning scores to each of those conditions. And this allows that relative weighting I was talking about around the different pros and cons to be included in the process. And so a couple of the hints that I'll give you. First of all, when I start off with this, I assign all of my lowest descriptions or conditions as 0. So I put all the numbers as 0. Then I go and complete the highest scores relative to the other highest scores. And I'll explain this in a tick with an example. And then I complete the middle scores. So what do I mean about those 3 hints? So first thing we do is for each of those descriptions, we put each of the lowest description or the poorest description, we give it a score of 0. So we can whack them in fairly quickly. Then we start putting on the most positive scores, but relative to each other. So you can see here for the first one, we gave that a score of 5. For supplementary feeding, we gave it a score of 3. But if you go down here to the likely margin to be made, we gave that a score of 8, which means that we put much more emphasis on this one than we do on the amount of supplementary feed we've got. Now, that doesn't mean that each of these shouldn't be considered in our decision. It just means that we put more weight on this one. Exactly the same as I said before about the descriptions. If you disagree with this and say, no, I'd rate that higher or lower, or I think that's too high or that's too low, then you would change them. The idea of these numbers is to get them relative to each other. So what's the relative importance of the margin to being made compared to supplementary feeding? And we do that by putting those numbers in a table there. And then you go and fill out your middle numbers. So this is the way this group came up with it. So if everything was perfect, you'd get a maximum score of 30 out of that. If everything was imperfect, the worst possible result, you get a score of 0 out of that. Once we've got something like this set up, before we're trying to actually make the decision, but we've thought about what's important in the decision, we can then start to think about, well, how are things shaping up? And this is where the information that you get from Graham, the information you get from sale yards, the information that you get from your farm about how much feed do I have, and doing feed assessments makes sense, because you need that to be able to determine which score you're going to use down here for each of those major considerations. The fifth step is what I call the decision descriptions. And you add up the maximum score, which in this case, as I said, was 30, and then you start to think about what decision would I make. So simple way of doing this, I just say, here's the 6 that I need to consider. If I had heaps of feed in front of me, I had heaps of supplementary feed on hand, or I could get more at a good price. The seasonal forecast, both the short term and long term, is really positive. Animals are easy to source. I could double my money if I buy them, and I've got cash on hand, so I don't need to borrow. I'm guessing with all of those things stacked up, you'd decide to buy. You'd decide to buy animals. And so one of your decision points, what I call the bookends of your decision, is to buy. So it means a score of 30, you'd be buying. Then I go and do the exact opposite. What decision would you make under the minimum score, which will be 0? So if feed was really tight, there was limited supplementary feed and it was hard to get your hands on, the seasonal forecast was really bleak, the animals were difficult to source, it'd be marginal if you're going to make money out of them anyway, and you'd have to borrow money, I'm guessing that you're probably not going to go out and buy. And so our 2 bookends is buy at one end and don't buy at the other. Now, this is a relatively simple example, but it shows how we start to build what are the possible decisions we could make. And then for this group, they said, but yeah, if you fall in between, we might buy a lot of animals, but we might hedge our bets a bit. So they then put in a third decision description there as hedge and just buy a few. So if it's not diabolical, but it's looking pretty tight, I mightn't go and buy a big number. I might only just buy a couple of them. And then the decision is, well, just how many do? We can do that on feed budgets and seasonal forecasts and so on. So that helps us to describe those decision descriptions. Now, they're descriptions at the moment. The second last step is you assign some preliminary scores. And so this is the score when on balance, when you check off the 6 of those and give a score for each of those 6, what is your decision? So in this case here, this group came up and they said if it scores greater than 21, we'd buy. If it's less, the score is less than 12, we wouldn't buy. It doesn't have to be diabolical, but probably is not to buy. Now, there's nothing really magic about these numbers of where you come up with those numbers. I generally say to people, put some numbers on it and then we test it in a few scenarios. And this is one here, example here, where we've tested these decision scores. So in the first scenario, and usually the scenarios I like to think of, particularly if you've farmed for a few years and you've got the luxury of hindsight to know when we had a drought in such and such, or when we had feed in front of us at such and such year in 1996, this should have been the decision we made. So you call on your past experience, call on your gut to help inform these decisions. So we run the scenario. What if you had just a reasonable amount of feed? There was limited supplementary feed, but you could buy if you needed to. The short-term forecast the seasonal forecast in the short term isn't good, but in the long term it looks pretty good. So you score it a 4 for that. Animals are difficult to source, but if we could get them, we could double our money if we did that. But we'd have to borrow money. You'd get a score of 16 if you add all of those up. So against the decision description there, it sits roughly in the middle. Maximum score 30, about 15. So what we're saying there is you'd consider buying a few. Not many, but you'd buy a few, because not everything's stacking up right for you, but some of the factors are. One of them in particular that we put a lot of weight on is you could double your money in doing it. But some of the downsides is we'd have to borrow and they might be hard to find. But on balance, it'd be worth trying to chase a decision to try and buy a few. And you can see some other examples there as your scores change. So as you've got more feed, that the long-term forecast is positive, then your scores change accordingly, and therefore your decision in there changes. So that's the steps or the process that you go through. Might look a bit daunting to start with. For most groups, if I take them through, it takes about 45 minutes to put that together. I'll show you just a couple of examples. I've got about 40 different examples around here around using this type of process, from everything from buying land, leasing land, buying machinery, to do we buy more feed over winter, do we cut hay, all of those sort of things. Whole lot of examples that I've put together, change our lambing time, so on. A couple I'll just show you. This is one that we use at home. This is, do we adjust our stock numbers carried through spring and summer? So we have a winter growing season, basically, autumn break around Anzac Day, finish up about October, November. But in early September every year, we pull out this decision matrix. They're the 6 critical factors that we think are important. The current feed supply, what the forecast is, what our stored soil moisture is, because that's critically important to us, current price of livestock, future price of livestock, and what supplementary feed we've got on hand. So we go through this assessment every September, and then you'll see the different descriptions that we've got there based on each of those. And there's our decision matrix down the side there on the right-hand side. We pull this out every year. Okay, last year when we went through that, it took us about 10 seconds. We ticked off number 6. We ticked off, it was about a 2 for that. It was a 4 for that because we were very lucky last year in where we were and prices and so on. So what did we did? We retained all our stock and in fact did quite a lot of fodder conservation. The year before that, we were down here. We scored a score of 9 at that same time. So the year before, we had this in our kit bag, we pulled it out start of September and we offloaded a significant number of stock earlier. Sold cows with calves at foot, where we rarely do, but that was one of the decisions that we already had. So the emotion around it all was taken off. We use this decision matrix very much to drive that decision. And we've got about 6 or 8 of these across the whole year that we consider. Here's another one with a client I bought, and this is a bit of a left field one, but he was a large cropper. He's got a few livestock, but he's mainly a large cropper. And one of the questions that came up when I was consulting with him is, do we sell cropping country to buy dairy country? Because believe it or not, in our part of the world, as things have dried up a bit, and dairy country or dairy industries had a quite challenging time, particularly for us because we sell a lot of processed milk. Prices of dairy farms are pretty low at the moment. And so this farmer was saying, well, maybe as part of my strategy in building my business is I should actually think about getting some more reliable, higher rainfall country. And so he said, do you think we should sell some of our cropping country and buy dairy country? Even though it seems like such an odd decision because he's geared up with a lot of equipment and does a lot of cropping. But we went through this process, okay? And on the left-hand side, and I won't go through them all, there are a whole lot of critical considerations around capital growth. Does it help his current livestock trading enterprise? Could it be managed remotely? The last one's a real interesting one. He put in here the degree of challenge. He's a farmer that loves being challenged, so he likes being challenged and having to apply new thinking and solve new problems. And he rated that quite highly in what should influence his decision. And then we ended up with those 2. And to cut a long story short, he bought some dairy country. He was looking at buying another lot, but then when we went through this, it didn't stack up quite as well because of the impact it had on debt. Selling his cropping country, buying the first dairy block, reduced debt. If we did it again, it would actually increase debt again. And so he decided to stay as he's buying one dairy block, and it's worked out extremely well. That's what I call a good decision. Okay, so just in summary, what I like about the decision matrix, it slows down your thinking. If you try and put one of these matrices together, as I said, it'll take you 45 minutes or an hour, and it meets that criteria that Daniel Kahneman fellow was talking about. We don't make a decision in 5 minutes, but we actually spend an hour thinking about what's really important. And I can tell you it hurts your head when you try and think your way through that. Might look easy on paper when you see an example, much harder when you do it. Secondly, it makes it transparent for others to contribute and follow. What I really love about this is that more than one person can be involved in the conversation and the decision. Not by saying, what do you think, should we buy or should we sell? But what are the critical factors involved? Why do we put the sort of weighting on it? And where are those tipping points when we should think differently? I teach this at Marcus Oldham, or we teach this at the college now, and I've had some fabulous emails from young farmers going back and saying, I did this with mum and dad. It's the first time we've ever actually sat down and I understood why they make the decisions they do. and it was incredibly valuable, so everybody gets on the same page, including your advisor, including the accountant, including the bank manager, and so on. It's really, really useful for that. It also importantly narrows down what information and you want and the skills you need. We get bombarded by information all the time, but if you go back to some of those decisions, and one was around weather forecast, what I'm really looking for from Graham, and the information I prick my ears up around, is what's the forecast from a decile point of view, because that's what I've defined as being important. And all the other things about southern annular modes and this value and that value, that's secondary to me. What I concentrate on is what do I need to help inform the decision I need to make. And it combines the head, heart and gut, which I've mentioned sort of a couple of times on the way through the talk, that those descriptions that you put in, like that farmer that said, I like a challenge, is coming from the heart. You know, the weightings that you put on it are coming from your gut, from your past experience of what you think is important. It's not all about the facts, because I can tell you in these decisions, you will never find all the facts to make a good decision. And it enables your level of risk to be included. And so by that, if you want to be more risk averse, if you're not going to make that decision unless a lot of things stack up, your scores of where you change that decision just become higher. Okay, so instead of in that example of 21, where we made the decision to things are ticking along nicely, maybe we do more hay cutting, it might be 25 before that triggers that next decision that you do. So just to finalise, decision making is a skill. It can be taught, it can be practiced. The decision matrix is a useful way to combine those multiple elements that influence your decision making. And a couple of resources if you want. This is on the Grain and Graze website. It's called Farm Decision Making. A group of us put this together, but it covers off a lot of what I've been talking about your decision making. Also covers off around the complexity of decisions, stuff around your temperament and your personality and how that affects decision making. That's can be downloaded from the Grain and Graze website. So if you just typed in Grain and Graze or Farm Decision Making, it'll come up. And if people want, also on that website is those steps that I've just spoken about. It's called a Guide to Developing a Decision Matrix. So that's the process or the steps that you go through, with about 10 examples in the back as well of different decision matrices.